Hey guys, it's Miharu. The mid to late 2000s was an interesting time for gaming, and the same can be said for gamers in online spaces. Social media was still relatively new at the time, and the concept of sharing fanworks of your favorite media was really starting to take off. Fanart, fanfics, fangames, you name it. And Spyro and Crash were about to join the party. Let's begin with a bit of personal history, starting with Spyro. If you've seen my History with Spyro video or been around my channel long enough, you probably know that I'm not the biggest fan of anything that came after the original trilogy until the remakes. However, there's a bit more to the story than just that. You see, in between the releases of Enter the Dragonfly and A Hero's Tale, there were points in my life where I didn't really think about the Purple Dragon that much or at all. Not only because I didn't have the same attachment to the games as I once did, but for a teenager just starting high school, the years felt like they went on forever, and my mind was constantly preoccupied with other things. That all changed in 2006, when The Legend of Spyro hit the scene.
If I ever had a game that made my siblings cry, it was Spyro A New Beginning. From the stunning music to the gloomy environments, I cannot justify how well this game has made my childhood.
To give a bit of background, the Legend of Spyro trilogy served as a reboot to the original series. In this retelling of events, our beloved Purple Dragon is a rare breed born once every 10 generations, and as such is prophesized to shape the fate of the world. He's taken in by a family of dragonflies, and after learning of his origins, goes on a quest to stop the Dark Master Malefor and his forces. As you can probably guess, its high fantasy-esque presentation often gets compared to Lord of the Rings, right down to Spyro being voiced by Frodo himself, Elijah Wood. The gameplay is also less platformer-oriented than previous titles and focuses more on the use of various breath abilities for combat and puzzle solving. Although I see a lot more praise for it nowadays, the reception at the time was mixed, with the story and voice cast often being cited as positives, but the repetitive gameplay is a major con.
I discovered the Legend of Spyro series via some websites, and at that time I had no idea it was a reboot. I thought it was the same Spyro I'd come to know via Hero's Tale. Later, I bought and played New Beginning, and thought it was decent for what it was, although I struggled to grasp why everything looked and was being presented differently.
Now, I'm not going to act like Legend completely, reignited my love for the series, because that's not really true. But for a good 3 to 4 years, my interest was piqued again. And the reason for that was a certain character, but we'll get back to that later. To reiterate what I said in those other videos, this reboot just wasn't my thing. It was a complete departure from the Spyro I had grown up with, and the heavier emphasis on combat just didn't appeal to me.
When I first heard about these games, the ads showing made it clear right off the bat that these weren't going to be anything like what we grew up with in the PS1 era, which was the same feeling I maintained when I eventually played the games for the first time as a kid.
On the Crash side of things, it was a bit different. 2007 and 2008's Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant were and still are heavily criticized for their gameplay style, character redesigns, and the fact they made Crash say pancakes. Like, it would take years to even begin to undo the sheer amount of damage those last two things did to the fanbase. For me though, I was in awe. Remember how I said there was a point in my life where I didn't think much about Spyro? The same is true for Crash, but even more so. At the time Titans was announced, I had not played a Crash game for several years, the last one being CTR. So I'd been more or less entirely unaware of everything from Bash up until Boom Bang, aside from the very few ads I'd come across.
I remember this game fondly for the voice acting and animations being very over the top and quite fun to watch, though sadly due to the whole new game, it was quite hard to get used to at the moment of concept.
Basically, I felt the complete opposite about Titans and Mind Over Mutant than I did about the Legend series. Despite being more of a beat-em-up than a platformer, it was still really awesome to see Crash games presented in a similar fashion to Ratchet & Clank or Jak and Daxter, with a more open and less arcade-like approach. Cool character and creature designs, colorful environments, and this trailer which lives in my head rent-free. Plus, in terms of story, it didn't actually stray too far from what it already was. It was pure cartoony fun, and it's effectively what got me into the series. I remember wanting Titan so bad and being disappointed that I had to wait till Christmas to get it. And when I finally did, I stopped playing because I got stuck somewhere. But I still had a good time, especially with Mutant, which has since become my favorite Crash game next to Tag Team Racing.
Well, with that said, when you grow up and interact with a lot of people on the internet, yeah, it can really change your views, especially when you have to go back and play these games over again.
As I said before, not everyone took too kindly to this rebooted treatment Crash and Spyro were receiving. From the aforementioned complaints about character redesigns, to the repetitive gameplay, to voice acting, it was very apparent these games were products of their time, and people were having trouble adjusting to the change.
I understand why Crash and Spyro attempted to reboot themselves as action games with new continuities, but what was frustrating for me was how derivative these games felt tone-wise, writing-wise, and gameplay-wise.
Seeing these franchises get bastardized the way they were, like with these edgy reboots, just made me stop caring about them. It wasn't until years later when the remakes of the original trilogies for Crash and Spyro came out where I rediscovered my love for these franchises.
It was a difficult and confusing time for those who grew up with the originals, and they needed a place to vent, so they took to the internet. Now we can get into what this video is all about, the community. As previously mentioned, social media during this time was just starting to go mainstream, and the online world was a very different place than it is now. Other than DeviantArt, a majority of my days were spent on a variety of forums.
The world of forums played a big part of the community in the 2000s. That includes the official Vivendi Universal forums, in which the Crash and Spyro communities sort of intermingled. But as for myself, I was generally more into the Crash franchise, so eventually would migrate to HPZR's very own Crash Mania forum, in which I became a moderator and then admin alongside JB and several others.
Crash Mania would quickly become one of my favorite hangout spots after refamiliarizing myself with the franchise. I remember going through the character pages on the main site and looking at how all of them changed over the years and just being so excited to engage in conversation with the fanbase about these new games and even the older ones. I would quickly learn that the former was not viewed in a very positive light.
I think Crash of the Titans caused the biggest divide back then, with Radical Entertainment's designs really splitting people about why Crash had tattoos, what happened to Uka Uka, and oh no, Tiny changed species. It's kind of funny looking back at it.
Wanting to be a part of the community, I jumped on the bandwagon and mindlessly bashed these games for no reason. Years later, I would come back to these games and found a new appreciation for them on my own terms.
Despite that divide though, I managed to somehow avoid being met with too much hostility for my opinions during my time as a forum member. By the way, in case anyone's curious, I went by Bunny/Usagi Yuki and had a picture of my OC as my avatar. Smaz even says he remembers me from back then, which is just surreal. Oddly enough, I don't remember hanging around any Spyro boards like Spyro Forum or Dark Spyro, but those are still around today, even if they aren't updated frequently. Just goes to show how much my bias affected me. I was at that age where I wanted everyone to think I was cool and talented, so I often tried to involve myself in a lot of discussions and projects. This included posting fan art and of course my own characters, making low-quality music videos, convincing myself I knew how Games Factory 2 worked, and constantly asking people if they needed a voice actress for whatever they were working on, which is honestly something I still do now. I'll come back to that as well because it's pretty important. One of the many methods for marketing this new era would come in the form of Crash Village and Spyro's Lair, MMO-style browser games that were the face of each respective website from 2007 to around 2009, although some sources say the former was still running until 2011.
I used to visit Spyro's Lair and especially Crash Village all the time in elementary school. I'd spend hours and hours of my elementary school computer lab days just playing on Crash Village all the time.
The main gimmick of these sites was creating your own edgy dragon OC or mutant abomination, chatting and spamming emotes to other players, and playing a variety of minigames. I honestly have no memories of actually doing anything on either site, but I do still have these screenshots of the characters I created from back in the day. Both are now considered partially lost media, but they remain strong in the memories of those who had the privilege of playing them in their heyday.
During my spare time online, I also played around on the Spyro's Lair website, customizing my own dragons, playing minigames, and chatting with my friends. Those were the good old days that I wouldn't mind coming back to again.
Along with the classics, The Legend of Spyro was something I used to play a lot as a kid. The best thing about this trilogy, though, is that the stylized art style is very appealing, which is something that I'm a big fan of.
As are many others. The Legend series certainly knew how to jumpstart the imaginations of players with its deep lore and intriguing characters. Which brings me back to that certain character I alluded to earlier. The main reason for my interest in these games? Well, as you probably already guessed, that was Cinder.
I didn't play the games back when they came out, so I wasn't really so much into the community except for Cinder, who I googled a lot and I researched, and she was really fascinating to me.
Oh, the impact she had on the fandom, for better or for worse. But I think it's safe to say my reaction was a pretty positive one. I remember every time the trailer for A New Beginning would come on TV, I would fangirl over how hot she was. Granted, I thought she was male at the time, but needless to say, my feelings didn't change once I found out she was female. But hey, I was a 14-year-old girl obsessed with the goth and punk aesthetic, and a cool black dragon with red accents and a sickle on her tail shows up? How did you expect me to react? Long story short, Cinder was the main villain of A New Beginning, a dragon corrupted by darkness who sought to bring back her master, Malefor. After being defeated, she reverts to her true form and joins Spyro, eventually becoming his love interest and even a playable character in Dawn of the Dragon.
By the time all 3 Legend of Spyro games came out, I was initially like, meh. Though I was intrigued when I saw a commercial for Dawn of the Dragon and saw that Spyro now had a female companion.
And, oh boy, if anything contributed to the negativity surrounding this character, it was the fact that she was now romantically involved with the protagonist. Now, I'm not about to say that everyone hated this decision, far from it in fact, as this pairing did and still does dominate a large portion of the fandom. The reason this was such a big deal at the time is because, up until that point, Spyro had never really had a fully fledged love interest before. The closest we had were Elora and Ember, who were both portrayed as having unrequited crushes on him, the latter even more so. So when Cinder was introduced, and she was revealed to be the same age as Spyro, it was only natural that people would start shipping them. But as we know, with any ship, there will always be those looking to sink it. And in this case, I can see where those people are coming from. See, while I do support this couple myself, it actually wasn't the intent of the developers for them to get together. Rather, it was the result of fan demand, or suggestion if that's too harsh. Ignoring the fact that the GBA version of the Eternal Night incorrectly refers to them as siblings, Legend's lead concept artist Jared Pullen revealed in this 2016 interview that they hadn't considered the possibility of a romantic relationship between the two until involving themselves in fan discussion, though he does say that's how he eventually would have gone with it as well. That was a lot to get through, I know, but I felt it was necessary to mention Cinder as she would be the catalyst for this overwhelming influx of fan work Spyro was about to receive during this era. Just a massive amount of beautiful and emotional, and sometimes risque, artwork, animations, and stories. Not to mention those oh-so-popular 480p AMVs set to a song by Cascada or Linkin Park.
Like Linkin Park and Numb is first thing that pops up into my head when I think about The Legend of Spyro.
I do remember in my very early YouTube days, say around 2008, I made music videos of the Legend series singing Disney songs. Hey, I was 13, go easy on me.
The AMV I found from New Beginning was set to Green Day's Boulevard of Broken Dreams. I still remember my mom gasping at the fact that they used the uncensored version, so the F-bomb was kept intact.
And this is where the biggest differences between the reboots begin to show. Unlike Legend, Titans didn't add any new characters to the main cast, make any major changes to the plot, or anything like that. It was, at its core, still Crash Bandicoot. And while that should have made it easier for fans to just incorporate the new designs into their works, that just happened to be the crux of the problem in this case. So most of them were just sticking to what they knew and pretending these games didn't exist. Oh, but that didn't stop people from creating their own stories that drastically differed from Crash's typical feel. One such story was Outcast Bandicoot by Teira-Nova, known then as Lurking Leanne. Originally written in 2003, this fanfiction explored the origins of Crunch Bandicoot before the events of Wrath of Cortex, and spanned over 100 chapters. Most parts were eventually adapted into animated form from 2004 to 2009, which were then spliced together into a full-length movie in 2014. But while the film garnered attention and praise from some viewers, it also faced criticism for its unusually mature tone and subpar quality voice acting. Despite that, it still remains an impressive and noteworthy contribution to the community, and a relic of its time. Before we end this section, I wanted to quickly mention fan clubs, and by extension, anti-fan clubs. Remember these? These were quite prevalent on forums and DeviantArt groups back in the day, and they were a way for kids and teens to converse with others who shared their interests and opinions. But as we all know, it was mostly a breeding ground for shipping wars and other fandom drama. On DA, it at least made some sort of sense, as people could post their art in Fics, but other times we would get gems such as Official Cinder Fan Club, the Cinder X Sparks Fan Club, Anti-Apes, Anti-TLOS Hermit, and the Officla Cinder X Spyro Club, the contents of which usually looked something like this. They weren't the most exciting of spaces. Let's talk a bit about Fangames, starting with Spyro. Oh, well, that's unfortunate. Yeah, this list kinda speaks for itself. If you were following the progress of any Spyro-related fangame in the 2010s, there's a 99% chance it never saw the light of day. Now, as I'm showing this footage, you may have noticed a common factor. They're all attempting to bring back the traditional Insomniac-style gameplay and world design, which is reasonable. At the time, Spyro fans had no way of knowing we'd get a remake that would even give us hope of this return to form. Of course, Reignited turned out to be a blessing and a curse for those involved with these fangames, as in 2018, some of them would be forced to shut down at the request of Activision, and others would disappear without an explanation, though most likely out of fear of getting hit with C&Ds themselves. But of course, this is about the impact that the rebooted series had on the community, and in my search for a legend-inspired game, I was eventually led to this Reddit post by user Vicemargo. For those of you who were maybe unaware the past couple years, despite there being many Spyro fangame creations that have risen and fallen, there was another going on behind the scenes, attributing another perspective from the Legend of Spyro series. Some years ago, a man came together with a small development team to form Project Cinder. For about 2 years, they released multiple update videos showing the fair amount of progress they did. This rivaled what many of aspiring developers were trying to accomplish, though their team had the same problem with communication as they did with presentation, releasing updates only every few months until it finally sunk below the dark sea of lost dreams. Couldn't have said it better myself. Project Cinder was a very promising fangame that aimed to tell the story of the female dragon's life before and during the events of A New Beginning, despite footage clearly using her Dawn of the Dragon model, but I assume this was just a placeholder. It was being developed in Unity, and as the post said, received regular updates for around 2 years before being cancelled in 2015. The website is no longer operational, but fortunately remains archived through the Wayback Machine. Vicemargo, after name-dropping Project Frixion, which we'll get into in a bit, then goes on to say they were able to get in contact with the lead programmer and actually got a response. I'm really sorry, but we're no longer working on the Cinder project. We have all the files though, and maybe one day, hopefully, we'll take the project back to life. Again, thank you for your efforts and commitment to the project. I hope to not have failed you and the entire community. Of course, this post is nearly a decade old now, so I doubt that day is coming anytime soon. It really is sad to see just how many of these creators ended up having to abandon their projects for one reason or another, especially when they had so much potential. In fact, at one time, I even had hopes to create my own game centered around Cinder. And before you ask, it obviously never went anywhere. This amateur sprite work is literally all I have to show for it. As I said earlier, I was doing this through Games Factory 2 and had no idea how it worked. But game design wasn't that important to me anyway. No, my real passion was and always will be voice acting, which brings me to Crash fangames. And Crash Mania just happened to have an entire section dedicated to those. Now, Crash was very much in the same boat as Spyro when it came to Fangames, being that most of them were based on the originals up to Twinsanity. Crash Bandicoot Tiki Quest was a rare example that actually did incorporate parts of the Titans designs into its sprite work. It was also quite interesting in how it played, appearing as an odd mix of Crash and Sonic, but making use of mechanics that had previously just been touched on and making them a core part of the gameplay. Those of you who have been in the fandom for a while are probably familiar with the name Jump Button. You might know him as studio producer at Summit Sphere and one of the lead designers on a little game known as Anton Blast. But before that, he was and still is one of the most prominent figures in the Crash fangame community, bringing us the 3-part Crash Bandicoot Energon in 2007, and eventually upgrading to 3D with Crystal's Wrath in 2013, which was being co-developed by Pat Strikes Back. The latter hasn't received any major progress updates for a few years now, but it's no surprise there was quite a significant amount of hype surrounding its development, as it too sought to revive the image of classic Crash. Bringing it back around to the voice acting thing, when I was about 15, I auditioned for the lead role in a Crash Mania fan game called Virtual Coco, or as it would come to be known, Coco Bandicoot Digitalized. As you can probably guess, it followed Coco as she becomes trapped inside and must traverse through a digital world. It was created by Robert 3DG, a well-known artist and 3D programmer on the forum. He even drew this lovely picture of me as a Bandicoot. Unfortunately, much of this game's information has been lost to time, and all that remains is a screenshot from a random page of the original thread, and these images which I myself had saved from back in the day. I remember being absolutely overjoyed when I got the part of Coco, and I would follow this thread religiously until updates slowed down and came to a halt. The last time I heard from Rob was probably somewhere around 2009 when he announced he had stopped working on the game entirely. This was really disheartening for me, of course, because, hey, I was a teenager who thought I'd get my big break as a VA in a cool game. I remember being on another Crash forum with this image as my avatar, and underneath it I had written, "I am Coco's voice." Like, I was so proud of getting that role. And it wasn't the first time something like this would happen either. And now we come to what is perhaps the most interesting category, fan films. While there isn't a whole lot to talk about in this section, it's my favorite simply for how much it embodies the naivete and ambition of kids with big ideas. We all had a phase like that, right? Coming up with a plan to do something huge, but not realizing the amount of effort it takes to actually execute it. For those interested, I have a whole video dedicated solely to discussing Spyro fan films and why they failed, but I'll give you the rundown. Though it was a great source of inspiration for aspiring filmmakers, the conception of these fan films didn't necessarily start with the Legend series. Legacy of Ages, for example, based on the 2005 fanfiction Dragon of Destiny, was a story set during the original continuity, just after the events of A Hero's Tale. Although the creator initially expressed dissatisfaction with the reboot, he would eventually decide to include the characters of Cinder and Malefor. His posts on Dark Spyro were often filled with critiques about Vivendi's handling of the franchise, highlighting his own desires to take Spyro in a new direction. Originally slated for a release in fall of 2008, Legacy of Ages would face repeated delays and false claims as the months turned into years. And the most disappointing part? I auditioned for this too. Project Frixion, on the other hand, came to be due to the cancellation of The Legend of Spyro 3D, and as such struggled with the aftermath of its demise. It was to be a straight adaptation of A New Beginning, followed by the sequels if it all went well, with a few extra details to clear up any continuity errors present in the games. Needless to say, things did not go well. Lack of knowledge in 3D animation, drastic changes to the script, and a constant passing of the torch between directors would put Frixion in an even more frustrating position than Legacy of Ages. However, that's not to say they didn't show any signs of progress, as their DeviantArt page offers a look into what could have been. Throughout its 5 or so years of on-off development, Frixion amassed quite a fanbase, and in 2017, some former team members banded together to form Convexity Studios, which now operates through Discord.
And when Project Convexity was attempting to make their own film, I did my best to help promote them through my videos. As such, the Legend series holds a special place in my heart, and I hope it'll still stay alive in the future.
I wish there was more information I could offer in the way of Crash fan films, but other than Outcast Bandicoot, all I could find were some ideas from the 2010s and 2020s, and well, none of them were based on the Titans era as far as I can tell. Despite the controversies surrounding these games, they still managed to spark a remarkable outpouring of creativity among fans. The bigger the online communities grew, the more people came together to share ideas. And even if most of these projects were never fully completed, they remain a testament to just how much joy these franchises have brought us.
The Legends era of Spyro had given me just as much impact as Lord of the Rings did at an early age. It solidified my belief that storytelling is not about glitz and glamour, riches and good deeds, and power makes great. Even heroes are vulnerable, and plenty of villains aren't being villains out of pure spite. And Legend of Spyro, albeit not perfect by any means, does reflect that greatly.
When I first heard of The Legend of Spyro, I was excited, and I couldn't wait to play, and when I did, it was a wonderful experience, and I look forward to the continuation of the series. I never since it's had a special place in my heart, along with dragons in general, because of the games.
Though I haven't drawn or written down stuff about the game, sadly. It did, however, make me inspired and wanting to create some comics or stories of my own, in hopes of people loving my work.
At the time, it didn't personally impact me, but I've since garnered a major appreciation of the edgier aesthetics, and it's rather fitting given this was the late 2000s when things were a bit edgier. Definitely evoking a feeling of Hot Topic or Spencer's, because I used to love walking around those stores.
These weren't terrible games by any means, but they're also not the best of what the series could be. Overall, I do like these games, and they did help us appreciate both these series even more when they made their eventual return.
Overall, the Titans duology and Legend reboot trilogy make up, for me, one of the most interesting and compelling eras of Crash and Spyro to ever exist. The Legend games have amazing moments and music tracks that took me to emotional places I never thought Spyro could. And it was Titans that helped me realize back in the early 2010s that Crash is still fun, even during the era where first-person shooters were thriving and platformers were seen as a dying genre. I can't thank these two interpretations of my favorite video game characters enough for keeping my hopes up that we'd get to see the Bandicoot and Dragon rise from the ashes back to their former glory once again.
This was by far the weirdest era of Crash and Spyro, but also one of the most influential. And you can see, from the cinematic storytelling of Legend to the dated yet entertaining humor of Titans, how that influence persists all these years later. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and a huge shout out to everyone who participated in this video. As always, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe for more casual gaming content, and I will see you next time. Until then, this is Miharu, signing off.